Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this discussion meeting with Professor Shai Feldman. We're here to talk about the Iranian nuclear program, the state of the debate. I'm Mark Fitzpatrick, the director of the IISS Nonproliferation and Disarmament Program. We're very pleased that Shai is able to come today. He's in town for some other business, and thought it might be good to have a discussion meeting. We were together in Washington in November. It was actually at the Y plantation. It was Maryland, and we thought maybe we could have a reprise of that discussion. Events have moved forward since November. Let me just start off by setting the scene. Yesterday, Iran made 4 announcements regarding its nuclear program. One was that Iran has they've used domestically produced fuel for the Tehran research reactor. They say they inserted it into the core of the reactor. Now, there's no military implications for this move. The Tehran research reactor is used to produce medical isotopes for cancer patients. It once was used for plutonium experiments, but it's purely for peaceful uses today. There's no danger to this except for the people living around the reactor, because the fuel rods, if they're not tested extensively, if they're used without being tested, they could be dangerous. And I think what Iran meant is that they're testing the fuel rods in the reactor, not that they're fueling the reactor with the fuel rods. It wouldn't be sound. But they built it up as to be probably a bigger announcement than it really was. The second thing they announced is that Iran has a 4th generation centrifuge that is now being used. No further information about that 4th generation. I've been trying to find out more about it all morning. I think it's probably similar to the 2nd generations that Iran has been working on for the last 10 years. Actually, it got the designs for a 2nd generation centrifuge from Pakistan 16 years ago. Still trying to perfect that. They got a couple different models, and 2 years ago, they announced a 3rd generation centrifuge. No further information about that ever since then. So I'm not sure what really there is to this 4th generation. It sounds impressive. It sounds dangerous, but I'm not sure it really will significantly increase Iran's ability to produce enriched uranium. We just need to learn more about it. We probably will when the IAEA issues its next report in the next couple of weeks. Thirdly, Iran announced yesterday that it has 3,000 more centrifuges active at Natanz. They had 6,000 active as of the last IAEA report. They say they've increased that by 50% to 9,000. I don't know quite what this means either. Iran did have 8,000 centrifuges at Natanz, but 2 of them were not producing enriched uranium. They were active in the sense that they were installed and spinning, but they weren't enriching. I doubt very much that since November, Iran has been able to introduce 3,000 more centrifuges. That's just beyond their capability. So what they probably are talking about is the 2,000 that are already there. Maybe they got more of them working, and they probably been able to install maybe 1,000 more. That's maybe what this announcement means. So I doubt that it's a 50% increase in their capability. Maybe it's a 20% increase. That's still significant, but it doesn't mean that Iran suddenly is that much closer to being able to produce a nuclear weapon should they choose to go down that momentous path. The 4th thing that Iran announced was that they had answered a letter from Catherine Ashton, the foreign policy chief of the EU, who back in October invited Iran to resume talks on their nuclear program. And ever since November, everybody's been waiting for Iran to reply officially. Iran's been talking publicly about resuming talks, but no official response. They finally responded, and positively. They said that Catherine Ashton's letter had positive elements to it, and that talks for cooperation based on a step-by-step principles and reciprocity on Iran's nuclear issue could be commenced. So that sounds pretty good. Is Iran ready to talk in sincerity, as Catherine Ashton asked? Well, who knows? Let's see. I think the fact that Iran made all these announcements about their nuclear program puts them in a better position to be able to go to talks, because they can go to the talks now from a position of perceived strength. At least particularly to the domestic audience. They can say, we're here because we've made great advances. We haven't been impeded by sanctions, by sabotage, by assassinations. We've made advances on all fronts, and we're here in a position of strength. We're not here because we're being compelled because of sanctions. Iran's going to have to, if they're going to make any deal, it's going to have to make a deal on the basis of a face-saving way. And this, if I'm trying to find some silver lining in what yesterday seemed to be some pretty dark clouds, this might be it, if this provides the basis for talks. Well, we'll talk about that more in the discussion meeting. There was one other thing that wasn't announced yesterday. The dog that didn't bark was any announcement about Fordow. Fordow is the enrichment facility near Qom that's buried in a mountain under 100 meters or so of rock, impenetrable to conventional bombing. Iran has announced earlier that they would be moving centrifuges into Fordow, that they would be doing 20% enrichment there. They talked about tripling their production of 20% enrichment. 20% is very close to weapons usable, and it's the part of Iran's program that presents the gravest concern, because it would shorten that timeline to getting a bomb so much if they increased their production of 20% and did it in this place where they couldn't be hit by bunker busters even. But they didn't say anything about Fordow. We'll probably hear more about that in the next IEA report. Fingers crossed. And with that, I think I'll now turn over the floor to Professor Shai Feldman from Brandeis University, where he is the director of the Crown Center for Middle East Studies and a professor of politics and one of the world's most knowledgeable experts about both the Israeli scene and the American political scene, particularly as it involves events in the Middle East and the situation in Iran. I won't read out more of his bio because that'll take too much time away from the discussion. You all got the invitation, and you know who he is and what he does. Shai, can I ask you to take the podium and enlighten us?
Thank you. So what I thought I would do, since I'm allotted 20 minutes, is to give you, in a way, a snapshot of what I think the debate on this issue looks like. You're all here because we are cluttered continuously with a lot of noises about what Israel might do, what the U.S. might do, and it's coming in a rather chaotic way. So what I would going to try to do in the next 19 and a half minutes is to give you a sense of and try to put some order in, I think, the chaos that exists to some extent around this issue. And if there is one takeaway that I would like you to emerge with from this, is that there is, and I'll focus on the Israeli debate, although it'll be easy to see that there are also parallels between the Israeli debate, not identical, but parallels between the Israeli debate and the debate in the U.S. On these issues. But as far as the Israeli side of this, the one takeaway that I'd like you to have is that there is no such thing as the Israeli approach or the Israeli policy or the Israeli strategy with respect to. This issue is being hotly debated in Israel. It's debated in the media, but more important, it's debated inside the defense community in Israel. It's debated inside the government. It's debated among the so-called octet, which is the informal kitchen cabinet on defense and foreign affairs issues that Netanyahu has created. 8 ministers, it used to be the septet, it was expanded to 8 ministers, who are actually debating and making the decisions on the most important question, on every important question having to do with foreign and defense affairs. So what I'm going to try to do is give you a sense of what is it that these people are debating. What is the debate about? Okay. The debate focuses on 2 sets of issues. The first set of issue has to do with what would be the ramifications of all the other measures failing and Iran actually possessing nuclear weapons. So Israel would then face a nuclear-armed Iran. The first set of issues that are being debated is what are the implications of a nuclear-armed Iran. The second set of issues that are being debated is what are the ramifications or possible ramifications of an attempt to abort Iran's nuclear program by striking its nuclear facilities. That's the second set of issues. What are the issues that are being debated in the framework of the first set of issues, which is to say the ramifications of a nuclear Iran? There are essentially three big issues that are being debated in the framework of this first set. The first question that is being asked is a nuclear Iran an existential threat for Israel? And the problem with this part of the debate is that people are talking about the existential threat or not without actually defining what do they mean by an existential threat. What makes a threat existential? I think that you can read between the lines and say that most people, however, who refer to this question refer to the existential threat not in the technical sense. Okay, in the technical sense, during the Cold War, the United States was under an existential threat every day during 6 decades. I think that when people are talking about the existential threat, they actually mean that they ascribe to Iran a motivation to destroy the Jewish state, so that the possession by Iran of nuclear weapons is equivalent to Nazi Germany obtaining nuclear weapons in the late 30s. And of course, the Israeli Prime Minister has made that analogy on more than one occasion. What this boils down to is the question of, is a nuclear Iran deterrable? Would the logic of the Cold War apply to the case of Iran? And that, of course, is tied to the question of what is the assumption, a safe assumption about the Iranian leadership. Is the assumption of a quote-unquote rational actor, would that apply to the case of Iran? And here there are two questions. One is this Iranian leadership able to process information about the costs that might be entailed in the use of nuclear weapons? And secondly, would it be sensitive to the kinds of costs that are associated with a nuclear exchange? And so those who think that this combination of Islamic fanaticism and nuclear weapons would lead Iran to try to end the Jewish story and to essentially materialize what Ahmadinejad frames usually as a prediction and accelerate the prediction of Ahmadinejad by the use of nuclear weapons, clearly see this as an existential threat and doubt whether a nuclear Iran is deterrable. So the first question is it an existential threat? The second question is, would a nuclear Iran lead to a proliferation cascade? Here there are three kinds of sub-questions. Number one, would countries like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt feel an obligation to develop nuclear weapons or nuclear capabilities of their own in response to a nuclear Iran? Number two, would Israel, then facing a nuclear Iran, feel the need to sharpen its deterrent by all sorts of means, declaratory and otherwise? And the third is, what would be the reactions of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Iran to the combination, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey to the combination of Iran going nuclear and Israel sharpening its deterrent message? So you may posit a scenario in which Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey may not feel compelled to react to Iran's posture, but will feel compelled to react to the combination of the two. And the fourth question regarding this proliferation cascade has to do with the U.S. side of this. How quickly would the U.S. move to try to then prevent a cascade by, for example, offering nuclear umbrellas of the kind the U.S. provides Japan and South Korea to dissuade these countries from reacting to Iran's nuclearization? So there are all sorts of smaller questions involved with this second issue, which is, would it lead to a proliferation cascade? The third question regarding the ramification of a nuclear Iran has to do with the issue of would it embolden Iran's allies in the region? To what extent would a nuclear Iran encourage parties like Hezbollah and Syria, depending on what scenarios one ascribes to the Syrian scene in the future? Would it lead parties like Hezbollah and Syria to behave in a more emboldened and reckless and violent way, assuming that Iran would deter Israel from reacting to these more bellicose form of behavior? And again, there are views on both sides of this debate, and we can get into them in the Q&A, since, as I said, I will at least try to limit myself to 20 minutes. So these are the three issues that are being debated in the framework of this first set of issues called what would be the ramifications of a nuclear Iran. Then there's the second set of issues revolving the question of a military strike to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran. And here there are also a number of issues that are being debated in the framework of the second set. The first question is there time, or how much time is there? And here it's not a state secret to say that this debate is totally out in the open, in the sense that the outgoing head of the Mossad in Israel, Meir Dagan, has told essentially the press in what originally was a background briefing and immediately became an on-the-record briefing, that his estimate is 2015. Barak, if you notice, Defense Minister Barak in the last couple of months has been talking about a 9-month timetable. Now, the reason these people are giving different timetables to and ascribing different time scales to the issue of how much time there is because they're focusing on different issues. I think that when Dagan mentioned 2015, he was talking about weaponization. In between, there are people that are focusing on the rate of enrichment and looking particularly at the developments of the last few months, some of the more recent developments of the last 24 hours that Mark mentioned, but before that, the move from 3.5% to 20% enrichment, and what does that mean to their capacity to move fast to 90%. And then there's the third focus, and the third focus is what Defense Minister Barak calls a zone of immunity. Barak introduced this concept a couple of months ago, saying the relevant issue is not when does Iran get nuclear weapons, the relevant issue is when will Iran enter a zone of immunity, namely a time point after which all these other measures to try to prevent Iran from becoming nuclear would no longer be relevant. Now, he was not very clear what comprises the zone of immunity, but I would think that it's not a wild guess to ascertain that what he was really talking about is the moving of more and more of the enrichment activities from Natanz to the fortified facility in Qom, which would make a military operation much more difficult. So the question here is, first question is, how much time is there for using non-kinetic measures to try to prevent Iran from going nuclear? The second issue is, what will be achieved by destroying Iran's nuclear facilities? And here again, the debate ranges between people who say, you'll only gain 1 or 2 years, you're going to face the same problem 2 years down the line, Iran is going to simply move everything underground, etc., etc. Those who are of a different view point out that if you look at the previous two experiences in the abortion of nuclear programs, the bombing of the Osirak reactor in 1981 and the bombing of the Syrian facility in 2007, in both cases it seems that many, many more years have been gained than even those who may have planned these operations assumed. So the second issue is how much time can be gained by bombing nuclear facilities. So that's number two. Number three is what would be the reaction of the Arab world? and again, I think Dagan has been on record on saying that he believes that bombing Iran's nuclear facilities may lead to a regional confrontation. The expectation, of course, of those who are opposed to such an operation is that Syria would see this as an opportunity to divert attention from its internal issues. Hezbollah would feel compelled to react by launching thousands of rockets against Israel. Some people talked about Hamas-centered scenarios. I think the likelihood of that has somewhat declined in the last couple of months. But these are the kinds of... And then, of course, Israel was expected to overreact to Syria or to Hezbollah, and before you know it, there'll be a regional war. The other side of this debate, of this issue, asks, the Arab world actually did not react to the bombing of West Iraq in 1981, and the Arab world remained totally silent following the destruction of the Syrian nuclear facility in 2007. What grounds are there to believe that the Arab world would react to the bombing of facilities in a Persian Shia country when the Arab world did not react to the bombing of facilities in Iraq and Syria, both Arab countries? So that's the third issue that's being debated. The fourth issue that's being debated is what would be the effects on the Iranian internal scene? So those who believe that the only ultimate solution to the worries about Iran's nuclear ambitions is an eventual regime change in Iran, say, well, you're going to bomb the facilities, the effect would be a rallying around the flag, and that will kill forever any chance of regime change in Iran. Some cynically might say the Iranians may almost invite such an attack because it will allow them to unify the people around the regime. So this is another issue that's being debated. And the final issue that's being debated, or that is out there, and with that I will end, is the question of what is the relationship between this issue and U.S.-Israeli relations? Which is to say, boiling down to this particular question, is it possible, and what are the costs that might be associated with an Israeli effort to abort Iran's nuclear program by bombing these facilities before the United States has reached the conclusion that all other measures have been exhausted? Now, again, those who follow the scene know that the United States has not reached that point. The view of both the White House and the administration, and especially the defense community, so far has been that there is more time to permit, to test the ability to stop the Iranian program through non-kinetic means. That the new set of sanctions are more effective, more biting, have a bigger chance to succeed where previous measures have failed. And so what you have is a constant communication between the national leaderships at the level of the President, the Prime Minister, at the level of the Secretary of Defense and the Minister of Defense on the Israeli side, and the Joint Chiefs and the General Staff of the IDF on this issue. The nature of these relationships are totally different from when these kinds of issues were first taken up in 1981. And I think that one of the changes in the U.S. approach to the Israeli question is that if you really want the Israelis to do something crazy, give them the feeling that they're alone. If you want to prevent them from doing anything crazy, give them the feeling that the United States is with them. And so part of making sure that Israel does not operate or at least reducing the likelihood that Israel would operate as long as the United States did not reach the conclusion that all other measures have been exhausted, is to give Israel the feeling that the U.S. and Israel are together on this issue. This is a theme that Secretary Gates and now Secretary Panetta have been emphasizing time after time, and the conversations between the Joint Chiefs, as far as I can read between the lines, in the Israeli side, our attempt to convey the same message. What I said in the end is based on reading tea leaves. The latter subject is not easily footnotable, but I think it's there nonetheless. So I don't know how much I've exceeded the 20 minutes.
No,
you've
you've got 2 minutes left of your time.
So I'll invent 2 more issues. No, I'm joking.
Thank you very much, Shai. That was brilliant. I think the title of this presentation had a misnomer. We said it would be the state of the debate. Obviously, it should be pluralized. Many debates in Israel and in Washington. Why don't you sit down here, and then because we might share the Q&A as we go along.
Pleasure.
Here. Go ahead in the front here. If you'll wait till the microphone comes and state your name and your affiliation, even though I know you well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bari Alameddin, Al Hayat newspaper. Thank you for posing all these questions. I'd love to hear the answer to all of them. However, I'd like to concentrate. I'd like to concentrate on 3 main ones, please. When do you think a possible strike could be, and also the Syrian and Hezbollah angle? Would Hezbollah, in your opinion, actually feel obliged in many ways, or would like even to take part in such a war and indeed strike Israel? And also the Syrian angle is if you can. Presumably Assad is still there. Thank you.
So does this work?
Yes, you don't have to do anything.
Okay. So on the first question, I have no idea. On the first question, I really have no idea. On the second question, which is the issue of Hezbollah, I think that my own view is that the idea that somehow Hezbollah's reaction will be automatic deserves some real questioning. And Sheikh Nasrallah made a statement I think it was something like a week ago, which of course is open to competing interpretations, and this is not the first time that he makes statements that can be interpreted in different directions. But he said something along the lines of, Iran will not ask us to react. Now, again, you can interpret this to say, we are not inclined automatically to react, and therefore, in a way, he found a way to sort of release themselves from pressure by saying, Iran will not ask us to react. And again, those who think that the reaction would be automatic would interpret the statement to say, Iran doesn't even have to ask us to react, we will react. I am a little skeptical of this interpretation, because I think that Hezbollah now feels vulnerable. And the reason it feels vulnerable is because with Syria remaining in the turmoil that it's facing, it's not so easy for Iran to come to the kind of support that Hezbollah needs if it reacts. Or, for example, if Israel, and there is, again, discussions of this in the media, this idea that somehow, in anticipation of this kind of a reaction, Israel might feel the need to take preemptive action against Hezbollah's capabilities. So, put it this way, in a situation that, and look, the fact of the matter is that there is a lot that Iran can provide Hezbollah without Syria. But there are also certain things, like big things, that have traditionally always gone through Syria. So in this situation where Syria faces the turmoil that it faces, if there is such a thing as a defense planner in the Hezbollah headquarters, if I were the defense planner in Hezbollah's headquarters, I would be rather nervous.
Gentleman in the fourth row on this side. Oh, well, okay. Well,
yes, I had a question.
It's actually the seventh row, but...
okay,
well,
but...
okay, well, go ahead.
Yes, I had one question. You didn't mention Iraq.
I'm sorry, can you state your name, please?
Bill George from Cambridge. You didn't mention Iraq in your calculations, considering their sort of changing dynamics, changing geopolitical positioning in favor versus Iran or versus the Arab world. And I'm wondering if, you know, some of the technical aspects to an Israeli attack would inevitably require some sort of transit over various countries, Iraq being the one most mentioned. How certain are the Israelis, and for that fact, it's probably what's delaying them, is how certain Iraq would be silent, how certain, you know, their approach would not be compromised. Hence, the probability of failure is rather high, which is probably preventing them from carrying out such a option.
What I try to do is give you a sense of the debate as I read it. The only fact that I can take note of for you is that the Iraq dimension does not figure in the public debate of this issue, or even the less public debate that I could ascertain. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and it also doesn't mean that some of the considerations you mentioned are not considerations, but I would say also that what I try to limit myself to is the strategic considerations that have to do with a nuclear run or a nuclear strike. You were pointing to some operational issues, and I can only say on the record that there is no way to address operational issues on the record.
Fair enough. Okay, so did I get it wrong? Fourth row, no. Then in that case, Gabriela Rifkin here in the third row.
I don't need to say my name. From Oxford Research Group. Thank you, Shai. Wonderfully comprehensive and very, very helpful. In terms of the level of debate in Israel and the different centers of power that you've actually mentioned, how much discussion is there about the reality that Iran is not going to give up its right to enrich? And what's the possibility of Iran having nuclear capability as opposed to weaponizing?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure about where Israelis are on this issue. I would say this: that this has been a subject of debate for some time now. There are really three questions here, or three alternatives, not just two. One alternative is one issue has to do with as far as Israel is concerned, can Iran's right for enrichment be accepted or recognized? The second issue, which came up recently, I mean, another contribution to this debate actually came from the American side of this angle. It was around an op-ed article that Graham Allison published, Graham Allison, the director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard, where he responded to what he understood was an offer made by Ahmadinejad in New York, which is to say a commitment or a willingness under certain circumstances to limit enrichment to 5%. And so the debate really is about, so there are certain, I would say in this debate, I find two schools. One that basically says, look, if there could be an agreement with Iran on the kind of monitoring and verification that would be satisfactory, that to allow verification that in fact they are adhering to such commitments, then 5% is better than 20%. Not as good maybe as 0, but better than 20%. And let's explore that. I think the Israeli, if I can sort of give you a sense of an average view, on the Israeli side, my sense of it is that the general approach to this question in Israel is that it's easy to monitor, or easier, or far, far easier to monitor 0 than to monitor, 5, than to ascertain that the other side has not gone beyond 5. So I think this is where I see more or less the debate around this particular question.
If I could add to that, this is a highly nuanced discussion, and it's very good. I think this is one of the areas where there may be a difference between Israel and Washington opinion. I think Washington opinion is moving in the direction of Gabriel's question, that nuclear capable is different from being nuclear armed. Israel typically says they cannot abide by a nuclear capable Iran. Leon Panetta more recently put the red line more in terms of a nuclear-armed Iran, although it was a little bit vague the way he said it. But I think that's the direction of the U.S. Opinion. In my own opinion, it's unrealistic to talk about preventing a nuclear-capable Iran, because Iran already is nuclear-capable. They have all the technology, they have all the low-enriched uranium they would need to make a nuclear weapon, or for nuclear weapons. It's only a political decision and a matter of time to get there. So to say that preventing nuclear capable, I think that's a question from last decade. The other question about the right to enrichment, obviously that has to be part of any solution if there's going to be a solution. The question has been, does one acknowledge that right at the beginning, in the middle, or at the end of any negotiations? Iran would like that right acknowledged right away. It actually has been acknowledged a couple times by American senior officials, but the EU3 as a whole EU3+3 have not acknowledged it, and I think they want to save it for a negotiation leverage. Okay, I've got many people now. First, go to Patricia Lewis here in the fourth row, then to a gentleman in sort of at the end on the left there, and then I'll pick up others.
Thanks, Mark. Patricia Lewis from Chatham House. Shai, thank you very much for an excellent, balanced discussion of the debates, several of them in Israel. So this may sound a little mad, but let's go there anyway.
As in mutual assured destruction?
Yes, exactly. You're getting me entirely. So the irony that's seen outside the sort of debates that we're having in these types of rooms is that the one state in the region that has stayed outside the NPT and has supposedly developed a capability is now taking such a high-handed stand against another state in the region that might be developing a nuclear weapons capability in the longer run. And my concern is this, that in selling to ourselves the concept of nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence, so much so that when we say the word nuclear, we either say power or deterrence after it. We leave out the weapons bit quite often. In so selling, I think we've done a very good job at exporting the idea. We've seen it in Israel and Pakistan. We've seen it now, I think, with North Korea. And we might be seeing it with others. And the model goes something like this. If we get nuclear weapons, it's an immunity from attack. We won't be attacked. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. I somehow doubt it. But nonetheless, it's being widely believed. So can we be a bit creative? And so my question is, and this is the mad bit, so is there anyone in Israel doing the hard maths and asking the really tough question is, what have nuclear weapons done for us lately? What have nuclear weapons ever done for Israel? What are they doing for Israel right now? And should we be thinking perhaps about something a little bit more outside the box? I mean, I don't like that phrase very much, but what about the Saban Center survey, for example, on the idea of getting rid of all weapons of mass destruction in that region, in the Middle East, and Israel giving up its capability in exchange for security on a different level. Is that completely crazy?
So, how many questions were subsumed under this one?
What good are nuclear weapons is the basic question here for Israel.
So, let me first tackle the preamble to your question, because I think it's very important. You asked not an unreasonable question. Okay, here is Israel outside the NPT framework, and it's taking, I think you called it a high-minded approach to so on, so on, so on. Yes, but. And I think that, again, all I'm trying to do is help you understand. I'm not a paid diplomat, so I'm not here to justify anything. Luckily, I don't have that institutional obligation. I can only help you try to understand where people are coming from on this issue. And here, I think that there are two dimensions of this that simply cannot be taken out of the equation if you try to understand the Israeli approach to this. And so I'll just mention them, okay? Number one, there is no other country in the region, aside from Iran, that challenges Israel's right to exist, okay? Not only that, but I would say more than that. The Iranian challenge to Israel's existence is contrasting sharply with the position of the 22 members of the Arab League. The 22 members of the Arab League adopted in 2002 and then reaffirmed in 2007 the so-called Arab Peace Initiative, which said, if Israel meets the following conditions, we are willing to embrace it, include it, integrate it into the region. Of course, I'm telegraphing the 2.5 pages resolution of the Arab League. That meant that there is a consensus in the Arab world today that if, under certain circumstances, if Israel meets certain requirements, the question of Israel's existence is no longer a question on the table as far as the Arab world is concerned. This is not the position of Iran. So the idea of equating Iran to any other country in the region, not to mention equating it to Israel, is just from the Israeli standpoint is unacceptable. That's number one. Number two, whether you like it or not, and I think that even, I'm sorry to have to say a good word for Saddam Hussein here, but even Saddam Hussein understood that Israel sees the issue of weapons of mass destruction differently than almost any other country in the world because of the experience of the Holocaust. Somehow, I don't have any other explanation as to why, because we know on the basis of the UNSCOM inspections that there were somewhere between 40 and 50 chemical warheads at Saddam Hussein's disposal, which he did not use during the Gulf War. He only used conventional warheads on the Scuds attacking Israel. I think that somehow, in the back of his mind, he understood that Israel's reaction may be unacceptable. He wanted an Israeli reaction because he wanted Israel to get involved and embroil Israel and be able to translate the Gulf War to an Arab-Israeli affair. Israel disappointed him by not reacting to the Scud attacks. But I think that he even understood, and he was made to understand, that there is something about this historical experience the Jewish people experienced with the Holocaust that causes them to see these kinds of issues somewhat differently than other people do, if you wish. And this commitment of, quote unquote, never again, is the fundamental ethos of the creation of the State of Israel. And therefore, Israel sees the whole relationship with Iran as completely asymmetric. Now, actually, the results of the Saban Center public opinion poll only reinforce this. Why am I saying this? Because, to the benefit of all you who have not read the results of the Saban Center public opinion poll, the surprising, and I would say surprising, finding of a poll run in Israel was that they found that, in fact, if positing the alternative of no country possessing nuclear capabilities, including Israel, a majority of Israelis support this scenario over the scenario of Israel and Iran both possessing nuclear weapons. What does that mean? It means to me that it simply reinforces the 2 points I made, which is that Israelis are so terrified by the idea that this leadership in Tehran, regarding which they cannot ascribe the assumptions of rational actor, would in fact behave rationally, that they're willing now to reconsider the issue of Israel's own option.
I'm sorry, can you just remind us the results of that survey? That's the one that had 64% of the Israeli Jews saying better to have 0 than 2
Yes.
nuclear armed states?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Gentleman in the back, and then we'll go to Chris Hobbs here in the middle. Okay.
Charles Vivian, a member of the Institute. Could I ask you a question of fact? To what extent and under what circumstances is a signatory to the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, allowed to enrich uranium?
Mark is a better expert than I. He'll correct me. But my understanding is that if enrichment is in the framework of a peaceful nuclear program and is under full-scope safeguards, there is nothing in the NPT that prevents enrichment. Am I understanding
That's
correct?
exactly correct. The NPT language about inalienable right to peaceful uses of nuclear energy is conditioned on fulfillment of the non-proliferation obligations of the treaty. So one might say there's an argument about whether Iran has fulfilled all those obligations. One can also say that the UN Security Council resolutions have created a new set of international law as it applies to Iran, which requires a suspension of the program, and Iran not having suspended would be in violation. But the NPT does not forbid enrichment in and of itself. So Chris Hobbs here, and then the gentleman in the front.
Hello, Chris Hobbs from King's College London. I'd like to ask how, if at all, the November IEA Board of Governors report on Iran has affected the debate in Israel.
It accelerated the debate. I mean, the report. Look, you have to distinguish between the small cadre of professional people that are reading these reports with magnifying glass, and the broader policy community that reacts more to the general impressions that the report was created. And the report created a few, the general takeaway, if you wish, of the report was that the report was quite damning, and therefore there is a greater urgency to focus on this issue.
I think that'd be the same in Washington. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, gentleman in the front here, and then after that, the gentleman way in the back.
Thank you very much. George Harnett, Record Currency Management. In your talk, you said that America feels that it needs to support Israel to keep it on the straight and narrow, and if it feels that it is supported, it won't do anything crazy. Do you think that Barack Obama is doing enough personally with Benjamin Netanyahu to make him feel supported? Because there's a sense that he really, really isn't. There's also, the other thing that happened yesterday was that Iran talked to sent messages to 6 EU countries saying they were considering stopping supplying oil in advance of the EU sanctions in July. Do you think that this shows that the sanctions are actually biting, in the sense that Iran is taking active measures to try and stop a complete oil sanction from the EU?
On the second issue, again, this is a very general impression, but my general impression is that the answer is yes. That all sorts of measures related to the last round in the UN and other unilateral measures and so on are having a greater effect, and I think that's you can discern some of this in some of the greater nervousness that you see and unhappiness that you see in Iran. On the first issue, look, the reason why I'm focusing on U.S. and Israel and not necessarily on Obama and Netanyahu is precisely because the relationship between these two countries are multifaceted, and it's not, again, a state secret that the relationship between Obama and Netanyahu have not been the best. The fact that President Sarkozy is more vocal about his attitudes about Netanyahu did not mean, and could not be interpreted as meaning that Obama, when the microphone was even open, did not agree with him. But you see, the fact of the matter is that we have to remember, we are almost 3 years into the tension between these two individuals. It started during Netanyahu's first visit to Washington after Obama came into office and he himself came to office. So the first visit, if I recall correctly, was in March 3 years ago. And of course, the initial confrontation focused on the Palestinian issue and the settlement construction issue and so on. But it was clear from that point on that these two individuals don't get along very well one another. But the fact of the matter is that during those the same 3 years that these two individuals have developed a less than intimate relationship between the two of them, actually Obama is correct in including reminding American voters that U.S. and by the way, Defense Minister Barak has seconded the same observation, that U.S.-Israeli defense cooperation has never been tighter as it is today. And so when you posit this question of Israel-U.S. versus this question of Iran, you have to understand that, yes, the individuals are important. The extent to which Obama reassures or doesn't reassure Netanyahu is important. But there are other very, very important facets to this relationship, which is the reason why I mentioned the relationship between the Secretary of Defense and the Minister of Defense, the relationship between the Joint Chiefs and the Chiefs of Staff of the IDF. Even when you limit the issue to the defense relations and not to other facets of U.S.-Israeli relations, they are multifaceted. So even if one could say, well, look, if the chemistry between these two individuals would have been better, if the relations between them would have been similar to the relations between Clinton and Rabin, then it would maybe have been easier to reassure the Israeli Prime Minister. I say yes, but remember that there are other facets to these relations.
Very good. Gentleman in the back, and then did I miss anybody else? Okay, gentleman in the back, and then Sarah Johnstone in the front.
I'll stand up so you can see me. My name is Oleg. I'm a first-year doctorate student in King's, and I'm actually examining the Iraqi Air Force. So one quick comment, then one quick question. In terms of going over Iraq right now has very limited air power capability, so if Israel decides to go through Iraqi territory, from an operational standpoint, it might not be that big of a challenge. My question is, the Israeli relationship with the Gulf states, has it improved over the last few months as a result of this, and where do you see it going forward? Thank you.
I think that if you, and again, the problem, of course, is who exactly do you read? There are at least two facets to this question, or to begin to answer this question. The first facet is to say that there is no question in my mind some, if not most, or if not all, of the Gulf states see the issue that we've been discussing in the last, an hour, probably is one notch below, but still very, very ominous terms. They are very, very, very worried about the implications of a nuclear-armed Iran. Now, the problem is, so you can deduce from the first facet of this answer is that Israel and the states you're referring to are on the same side of this issue. But there is a second facet to this that I do not take lightly. And there is, of course, a debate about how much weight to give to this, but I caution people who dismiss it too easily. And that was reflected in a few articles that Prince Turki Al-Faisal published in the last 6 months. And that has to do with the attitude of the same Gulf countries, especially, or maybe not especially Saudi Arabia, with respect to the question of the lack of resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And here, the reason I don't take this lightly is the fact that wherever the so-called quote-unquote Arab Spring goes, and I believe from the first moment that there is a big, big question as to whether this will go, and I think that the questions have only accumulated. But what I do think is that the one change that I think we can point to as a consequence of the Arab Spring is that whatever happens, leaders in the region, in my view, will have to pay slightly more attention to public opinion. And what basically was the main message that I understood, at least from Prince Turki Al-Faisal, was, and I'm taking like Prince Turki, making him much more explicit than he was, okay? But I think the basic message is there are certain issues, and I think Iran is a very good example. Maybe it's the most important among these issues, where we, the countries that you referred to in Israel, are on the same side. But as long as you don't resolve your issue with the Palestinians, and we get from the media the consequences of the continued festering of this conflict, there is no way that we can do our share, cooperate with you in the way that we would like to under these circumstances. So I think that in answering your question, you have to take both elements into account. I take seriously, and by the way, as we know, this figures into the U.S. debate as well. When General Petraeus, acting as commander of CENTCOM at the time, testified to the Senate Armed Services Committee, of course he was completely overinterpreted, way beyond the text of what he actually said. But the text was that the absence of a solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict makes it more difficult for the U.S. to face its other challenges in the region. What do I interpret General Petraeus to have said was, to deal with, for example, this issue of Iran, we need a regional coalition. And the festering of this conflict is a constraint against our ability to build the kind of coalition we need if we need to contain this threat.
Thank you. Last question, Sarah, in the front here.
Hi, Sarah Johnston. I work in the editorial department of the Institute. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk, Professor Feldman. One subject which hasn't come up at all, though, however, has been, neither you nor Mark has mentioned it, has been the assassination, and I use the word advisedly, of an Iranian nuclear scientist, and now an attack on an Israeli embassy vehicle in Delhi and an aborted attack in Georgia. Could you perhaps give an insight into Israeli public opinion on this? Does the Israeli public tacitly believe that it's their intelligence service conducting the attacks on Iranian nuclear scientists? Is there some sort of moral debate about that? And is there any fear that it could possibly get out of hand, or is this just a sideshow?
I don't know that the general public has an opinion on this issue, and I also, again, when you move from the realm of strategic considerations to operational issues, I frankly also don't think that on operational issues, whoever is involved in them, that the general public has any impact on. That's number one. Number two, I do think that that there is a broad understanding that a military operation to abort the Iranian efforts by destroying these facilities involves, any way you look at it, monumental risks. And I think that you can understand or deduce from this that that any efforts that are short of that, that is to say, low signature of whatever kind, to try to buy more time, is preferable to something that still involves a likelihood of escalation to a major war. So my guess would be that the public looks at this and it doesn't know who did what, who done it, but I think there is a predisposition to prefer anything that's lower signature than, you know, using blunt instruments. And I think, as I said, that I think that the more sophisticated people look at this and they say it's part of a package. You know, it's not just, you cannot look at this in isolation to the other measures that are being used to try to buy time, whether they're economic sanctions or diplomacy, or the use of Stuxnet, and so on and so forth.
Shai, I'll let you have the last word on that. This has been brilliant. You've been the most disciplined speaker I've had the pleasure to chair. Well within your time limits. We're at the hour mark.
The only last minute is that, unfortunately, the Institute surprised me, or you surprised me, by the fact that so many people came to this meeting. I, with two Israeli colleagues, wrote a report that was published about a week ago that tried to lay out this debate in greater detail. But you sprung a strategic surprise on me, so I only brought 40 copies with me. But and they're here for you to pick up after this is over. I promise you that those who still are interested in this and don't grab one of these, they're on the website of the Crown Center for Middle East Studies, so at Brandeis. So this is just a more convenient hard copy of what you can pick up from our website.
Well, the size of the audience is an indication of the esteem and reputation, and you have only enhanced it. So if you all would join me in thanking Professor Shai Feldman.